is Urban Roots, a podcast about preserving place through story. I'm your host, Deqah Hussein-Wetzel. This is a special crossover episode of Urban Roots and Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation and Planning's Historic Preservation Podcast, or GSAP for short, where award-winning journalist and historian A'Lelia Bundles has joined me for a Black history and preservation-focused conversation about her newest book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. Although when we recorded this conversation earlier this year, her manuscript hadn't been published yet, so I guess you could say I was early to the game. But A'Lelia is one of my favorite people, and her book is all about her great-grandmother, A'Lelia Walker, daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, heiress to America's first Black self-made millionaire. But in fairness, A'Lelia was more than a symbol of inherited wealth. She was integral in working with her mother's business and was a cultural icon, a connector of Black writers and artists and activists whose Vertner Tandy designed estate, Villa Lewaro, and Harlem Redesigned townhome became vital gathering spaces for the Black intelligentsia of the 1920s. In this episode, A'Lelia Bundles joins me to explore her ancestors' role in shaping Harlem's cultural landscape through hospitality, placekeeping, and preservation. We also discuss her journalism background at Columbia, what got her inspired to write about her family history, and dive into the importance of researching and elevating the legacy of notable Black women like A'Lelia Walker. This episode is a podcast swap produced for Columbia's GSAP Historic Preservation Podcast, also airing here as part of the Urban Roots podcast. Learn more about A'Lelia and her new book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance at a'leliabundles.com. And listen to the full version of this interview on Columbia's GSAP SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Columbia GSAP. And now, without further ado, my conversation with one of my favorite people and biographers, the glorious and magnificent A'Lelia Bundles.
My name is A'Lelia Bundles, and I am a graduate of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, class of 1976, a long time ago. I grew up in Indianapolis, and New York was always a magical place for me because we had gone to the city on vacations. But I then discovered that I had a Harlem connection because my great-grandmother and my namesake, A'Lelia Walker, had moved to Harlem in 1913, having persuaded her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, that they needed to have a presence in the mecca of Black culture and politics as it was becoming the center of that life.
That's pretty cool. Okay, I definitely want to pull on the thread about when you found out and learned about your family history, actually. But before we do, what did you kind of gain in terms of the journalism kind of degree and also it being from Columbia? I mean, I don't know if there was like a decision that you had to make in terms of the schools that you went to and you were like, yes, Columbia for this reason. But I do think there's a lot that the university brings with the New York connections.
So, absolutely. So we went to New York on vacations a couple of times, I think when I was 12 and maybe when I was a teenager. And I just loved New York. I loved the energy of New York. And I wanted to go to college there. I was interested in going to Barnard. And my dad did not want me to be living in New York at 18 years old. So he did a dad wisdom thing on me. And I ended up going to school, undergraduate school in Cambridge. But I wanted to go to graduate school in New York. And because I loved journalism, there was just no other place that was on my list besides Columbia, because it is the best journalism graduate school in America. So I wanted to be there. It is the capital of media, and that was my decision. And when I was there, really focused on being a journalist, I was really fortunate that Phyllis Garland, the first Black woman tenured faculty member at the J School, was my advisor for my master's paper. And Phil had worked for Jet and Ebony. Her mom had been an editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, a very famous Black newspaper. And when I talked with Phil about the topics for my master's paper, they were the typical cliched, boring topics. At the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And I wasn't walking around talking about that, but I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." It had not occurred to me to write about these women who who had been a stone's throw away from Columbia's campus. But that really validated the story for me, and that set me on a path that while I had a 30-year career at NBC and ABC as a producer and an executive, this was the other path that I followed as a result of the advice of my professor at Columbia. I continued to be involved with Columbia. I was involved both with Harvard undergraduate and Radcliffe undergraduate with the alumni activities there. But it was at Columbia that I found myself in with the opportunity to become a trustee during Lee Bollinger's early years as president. And that was such a wonderful experience for me that resulted in just me, opening things up, me at seeing the campus expand in Manhattanville, to seeing the community benefits agreement, and then having this honor of having the A'Lelia Bundles scholars, community scholars, that really does give some opportunities to people who aren't in PhD programs, but who have done really important work in the arts and in political activism and in historical research. And to have my name associated with that has been just like the honor of a lifetime.
So it sounds like you knew about your family history, but you didn't really think it didn't come to into your work right away. Now you explained why that changed, but how did the family history kind of start to come into your work, right? Because you were still working in news and television. So how did you balance that?
Yeah, I think it was really important for me to follow the thing that was my passion. My passion was writing. I mean, I thought of myself as a writer when I was 8 years old because one of my mother's friends had read a short story that I wrote and sent it to a children's magazine. So I had a byline at 8 years old. So that was who I wanted to be. My parents were the people who worked in the hair care business, and that I would go with my mom to her office. I worked in my dad's office in the summer, but that was absolutely the last thing that I wanted to do. It was important for me to become a journalist, to really develop those skills. But once Phil Garland planted the seeds of this story and I began to research it, I had these parallel tracks. The parallel tracks for me being who I wanted to be as a journalist, and also being able to begin to tell Madam Walker's story, because with all of the amazing stories, whether it was political campaigns or hurricanes or earthquakes or whatever that I was doing as a producer at NBC and ABC, the story of Madam Walker is truly one of the most amazing stories of American women and of African Americans. So I was on this parallel track, learning the skills of storytelling and visual storytelling and researching and learning the details of the family story, and those things eventually merged, so that I've now written 4 books about the women in my family and almost finished with, in fact, in the last stages of editing the manuscript for the first major biography of A'Lelia Walker, who Langston Hughes called the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I think we should shift to talking about her significance. So if people are listening to this podcast now and they are familiar with my work, they may have heard you in season 2, episode 4, which is Black Indianapolis Part 1, or Black Indy Part 1. And you talk about the significance of Indiana Avenue. You were just talking about how you grew up in Indianapolis. In the episode, you talked about the early booming Black business district that Madam Walker ended up seeing and noticing, and decided to move her company there. And so then you're saying, actually, your parents, they were still in Indianapolis working in the hair care business, which is incredible. So take me from the Madam Walker hair care to what and how A'Lelia was influential in moving even after, Indianapolis to Harlem.
So once Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis in 1910, her daughter, A'Lelia Walker, was running their Pittsburgh office. And Alelia's territory included New York City and Harlem. And she persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem, and moved and bought property in 1913. So the company remained headquartered in Indianapolis because it was a better place and a more economical place to do business, to manufacture products. But Harlem was the platform that really elevated them. And A'Lelia Walker used that platform both to build the business, but also during the 1920s to create an amazing cultural salon that she called the Dark Tower. She and her mother knew the artists and writers and actors and musicians of the 1910s, and then A'Lelia Walker in the 1920s. And so A'Lelia Walker was really an icon of the Harlem Renaissance. So that is the sort of matrix that I use to tell the story of her life. Madam Walker, businesswoman, entrepreneur, empowered women, employed thousands of women. Her daughter, in trying to create her own identity, had these amazing parties in the mansion that Madam Walker built in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County, in the townhouse that they owned on 136th Street, and in A'Lelia Walker's apartment, her pied-à-terre at 80 Edgecombe Avenue. So they were very much a part of the atmosphere and the identity of Harlem from 1913 through A'Lelia Walker's death in 1931.
Wow. She sounds really incredible. I mean, what were some of those significant things that you really were like, this is the information that's incredible that people need to know about, or even this is the important information that's incredible that maybe I'll put in another book, right?
Yeah, because 'cause I'm never writing another book.
Okay, fifth and final book.
We can say no. But and actually, yes, there's actually a lot that I'm leaving out. I started my manuscript. The manuscript that I sent to my editor, several months ago, was more than 600 pages, and I have now gotten it down to, I think, 400 pages, and that's kind of the right length. But I had to get rid of a lot of things because our life in New York was so fascinating. But the main takeaway for me with A'Lelia Walker's life is that here is the daughter of the first Black woman millionaire, woman businesswoman millionaire, and she is the first Black heiress. She is trying to create her own identity. Yes, her mother's a successful businesswoman, and she has some, ability to be a great entrepreneur, but she's an impresario. She is a person like her mother who loves culture. And one of the things that's important for me is that she was kind of a magnet for all of these amazing creatives who were converging on Harlem. There were the Burt Williams and Ada Overton Walker of that generation who were amazing entertainers, truly talented people who didn't get the recognition that they should have gotten because they were Black, people who were actors. And then there's that sort of next generation, younger than them, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, Aaron Douglas, another set of creatives who were more literary and artistic. And A'Lelia Walker knew all of them. And she was in a position with her 3 homes to have a place and to have the resources to be able to entertain people. There were lots of wonderful people in Harlem, lots of people who had nice homes, but A'Lelia Walker had nice homes, and she liked to be generous with her money to bring
Mm,
people together.
I love that. Love philanthropic people who have the money to be able to share the wealth. And I think it sounds like she's also shared just her exuberance and her, enjoyment for it sounds like she might have been a person who's connected a lot of people too, right? Like there's there's a lot I think that people who might be listening to this don't know about Harlem other than the fact that it was a hub of Black culture. I would love if you could like give us a visual of what it was like to be in Harlem in the early 1900s.
So here there's a quote that I have at the beginning of the new book about A'Lelia Walker, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. But this comes from a young entertainer who often went to her parties, and he said she was the center of a certain circle that was kept together only by herself. people one would never see except for her producing them. She is another one of the vivid and colorful and extraordinary personalities that have made the New York scene so extraordinary in recent years, and there is no one to take her place. So that was 1931, right after she died. But we're having a moment right now in 2024 with the beginning of what many consider the start of the literary Harlem Renaissance. In the New York Times yesterday, Veronica Chambers did this wonderful interactive piece with lots of illustrations about a dinner that happened in March of 1924 at the Civic Club, which was the coming together of many Black writers and white publishers who were setting the stage for what became the literary Harlem Renaissance. So in 2025, many people will be celebrating the centennial of Alain Locke's book, The New Negro. There's a wonderful exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now on the Harlem Renaissance. There will be lots more programs and exhibitions and documentaries that will be making us think about the amazing level of creativity, the flowering of culture that was happening. So A'Lelia Walker was very much a part of that. She wasn't a performer, she wasn't a writer, but she was a convener who brought people together.
That is so cool. I love this the resurgence of the Harlem Renaissance in a way that I think is a little bit more inclusive of real people's lives, right? I think that that's the disconnect that you get when you just hear about, oh, Columbia's in Harlem. Well, great, but like, for me, I'm always like, well, how can I even better interact with the community groups? And honestly, if we could have this literary moment back, right? This intellectual space that Harlem used to breed, like that's desirable to somebody like me as a person of color who lives in Harlem now. So I hope we can get there. But I'm kind of curious, what were some of the resources that you used to find and uncover this information?
So I've been working on this for so long, but there are a couple of different key sources for me. The foundational source is literally 40,000 documents and photographs that were saved by the Walker Company, by the employees of the Walker Company. So we have Madam Walker's letters, A'Lelia Walker's letters, their letters to their attorney, photographs, business records, salon photos that have been digitized by the Indiana Historical Society. We donated them many years ago. So that was kind of the foundation for me. And then I built upon that. I read through all of that, annotated it, made timelines, and then I visited more than a dozen libraries, historical societies, courthouses, manuscript collections, and of other people who had known them. I did oral history interviews with in the early 1980s with people who had known A'Lelia Walker, some of the Harlem Renaissance survivors, and they, once I spent the summer in New York, and once one said, "Oh, A'Lelia Walker's great-granddaughter is in town," then they opened up their phone books and put me in touch with the next person. So I had wonderful brunches and lunches and, afternoons with these Harlem Renaissance survivors. And then I used a lot of newspapers at that point in the 1980s and 1990s. I was, using microfilm and microfiche because it was before things were digitized.
Right.
And now I can go, yeah, and I use Columbia's database. I've used Columbia's library for ProQuest historical newspapers database, as well as newspapers.com and Genealogy Bank. But the connection to Columbia has been extremely helpful with my research because I can sit at my laptop wherever I am and do my research. I'm Googling the past.
No, yeah, I'm the same way. When I'm doing research and you have access online, it changes everything. I can't even begin to tell people like how hard it is to navigate microfiche because you don't have a search function.
There is no search function. And, I mean, in some ways, there is a serendipity about what you discover,
Hmm.
but it's random.
Exactly.
And there may be some things you miss when you can just put in a search word, but if you have that background of not having had the search function, then I think you have an instinct that says, "Well, let me just misspell this word and see, or let me try it another way." So you have some muscle memory that other people who only have had digitized search don't
Yeah.
have.
No, you're 100% right. I think honestly, microfilm newspaper research is one of the reasons that I realized like a podcast in formats of narrative storytelling is like really important because I was like, well, I'm just coming across all these really horrific stories looking in the past and it would be like I'm doing cultural resource management. So it wasn't particularly research on African Americans. And it was just looking up something regarding the construction of a highway in a particular place, which in and of itself actually quite has a lot to do with the African American history. And then I'm going further back and I'm looking at, the early 20s and the 1800s. And I'm like finding that, the lynchings and the really horrendous things that were happening too were just like so prevalent that I was like, well, do people are not doing what I'm doing and looking at these old newspapers. So how do we get this information out there? How do we share with people that these are the realities of America, and while at the same time there are really negative things that we do need to bring to light, there's also the glory of what Black people have been able to do to really make themselves, right? And I think that was really why both Madam C.J. Walker and A'Lelia Walker were so interesting to me as people who really continued to just do a lot in the communities that they lived in. So like what you're doing today is like absolutely wonderful. And then what your great grandmother was doing was so new at the time though. Like there probably weren't that many women who were out there having all these conversations with even the Black intellectual men. I mean, there's a division of space.
Absolutely. So, and I am in the throes of trying to finish editing this manuscript, and even after, many, many, many years of working on this, I'm still honing in, I'm still discovering something. There's a nuance that I think maybe I missed. And I was actually thinking very much about that. What did she do that was different? Because she had the space where she could bring people together, but it was different from, like, Georgia Douglas Johnson, who was a playwright and a poet in Washington, D.C., who hosted salons in her home that were mostly Black women writers, even though there's sort of famously Bruce Nugent and Langston Hughes came to some of her Saturday salons. Or there could be Regina Andrews, who was a librarian in New York, who had people come to her apartment, or Jessie Fawcett, who was an editor at The Crisis, and she had kind of intellectual gatherings in her apartment. They were, sort of very, as Langston Hughes said, at Jessie Fawcett's, it was probably they were having tea and not gin. Uh, but Amelia Walker was unique in the sense that she was not an intellectual, but she wasn't, by any means an airhead. She was a magnet who brought together, both the entertainment people and the artists and the writers and the musicians and some of the political people, because she had those relationships because of her mother. So she was a central point, a catalyst for a lot of people to coming together. And there just really wasn't anybody in exactly that same position as she was.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think about like the places that she was where she lived and I think the places that she might have interacted and gone to. And it would be good if we could take a moment for you to share a little bit about the tangible. Just, we're preservation oriented podcast, but I you know me and I am not too fixated on.
Yeah, and preservation is a key part of Madam Walker's life.
Yeah, I think there's like quite a number of buildings that I know of. And so maybe if you don't end up hitting on them, I'll ask you about. But I am curious about Harlem. You kind of reference a couple places. Are they still there?
So, Amelia Walker, when Amelia Walker moved to Harlem in 1913 and persuaded her mom to buy a building on 136th Street, it was kind of an ordinary townhouse brownstone. But she hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to remodel that townhouse. He did a new facade, and then they bought the house next door, and he created this double facade of a limestone and brick townhouse with the beauty salon on the first floor, beauty school in the basement, and their living quarters upstairs. It really looked much more like some of the buildings on the east side than the typical brownstone in New York. So it sort of stood out on that block. But she was very intentional about creating an architecturally attractive building. Tandy had done the design for St. Philip's Episcopal Church, a Black church in Harlem. So he was the premier Black architect. They really cared about the aesthetics. And then when Madam Walker moved her personal residence to New York in 1916, she started thinking about having a home of her own and hired Vertner Tandy to design Villa Lewaro, her mansion in Irvington, New York, which is now a National Historic Landmark. The house on 136th Street, unfortunately, is no longer there. It would have been there if there had been more consciousness about preservation and about the value of such an important African American site. But it was torn down in the 1940s and replaced by the very pedestrian, unimpressive, but important Count Cullen branch of the New York Public Library. That's on 136th Street. It's just a flat yellow brick building. But that building that was so incredibly beautiful would still be standing if Jacqueline Kennedy had inserted herself earlier in the
Yeah.
preservation. She was such a key part of that. But Madam Walker and Amelia Walker both cared about the aesthetics and about the architecture. One of the things that I discovered in my research is that Madam Walker gave the largest gift for the preservation of Frederick Douglass's home in Anacostia in Washington,
Oh,
D.C.
wow.
And that home was about to be lost. His wife was not able to afford the upkeep, and it was the National Association of Colored Women who banded together after other groups had been unsuccessful to save that house. And Madam Walker wrote, I think, a $500 check. And as the largest gift giver during the NACW ceremony in Denver in 1918, she was the one who got to hold the candle to burn the mortgage. But she understood, I just think instinctively, the importance of preserving a home that represented somebody like Frederick Douglass. And so for me, it's just kind of poetic that when she is writing the codicil to her will, she is trying to ensure that there is some kind of trust fund to make sure that her house, Villa Lewaro, is preserved.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because I know from my conversations with you in the past and some other folks who have been doing research with Madam Walker's legacy in Indianapolis, her home that was there doesn't exist anymore. And the factory and the manufacturing company's buildings don't exist anymore. But then, it was really wonderful when you had told me that her daughter wanted to continue her legacy and her contributions to what became the Walker Theater was really inspirational. Could you just kind of take us back to because it is, an A'Lelia inspired building, is there anything you could share with us about the decision that she, had made to want to kind of build the theater, but also like why a theater and why there? Because at that point, and spoiler alert, I guess that was in 1927, right? This is after Madam Walker had passed away, and she had probably wasn't necessarily living in Indianapolis full time. So yeah, I just wanted to know a little bit more about why theater, why there.
Mhm. So when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis in 1910, there was a really thriving Black business community, and she liked movies and would go to the movies in the afternoon. Her secretary, who was still living when I was growing up, talked about going to the movies with Madam Walker, and the apocryphal, but it seems true because there's a lawsuit story, is that they went to the movie theater one afternoon and Madam Walker was prepared to pay the 10 cents that she normally paid, and the ticket taker told her that it was 25 cents. And she said, "Yes, but the sign says 10 cents." And the young ticket taker who had been instructed to say this said, "Well, it's 25 cents for colored people."
Mm.
And Madam Walker was having none of it. She went back to her office. She talked to her attorney, Freeman B. Ransom, and they sued the theater. I do not know the outcome. I have seen what we have is the petition suing the theater, but apparently she decided at that point she was going to build her own theater. So she began to acquire property for a new factory. She needed to expand her factory. And though the factory was not completed before she died, it had been part of her vision. So her attorney, Freeman B. Ransom, followed through with the acquisition of the funds, with the design, working with the architects, and they built essentially a city within a city in Indianapolis with the manufacturing company, the beauty school, on the first floor, commercial space with the drugstore, the beauty salon, a restaurant upstairs, in addition to the factory and the beauty school were doctor's offices, law offices, and a ballroom that was a space for African Americans. And Indianapolis during the 1920s was really being influenced, the city government was being influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, which had quite a hold on government, elected officials. And so Indianapolis, that had been integrated somewhat before then, was becoming a segregated city. So this became an oasis. And this block long Flatiron building opened in 1927 with a theater and then a grand opening in 1928. And fortunately, is still standing and is a National Historic Landmark.
That's crazy. There's two National Historic Landmarks that are named in honor of your family. That I think that's probably pretty rare.
It is pretty amazing. And one of the things that was so, what did I know about National Historic Landmarks? But in 1976, two brothers, Vince and Robert DeForest, were working for the Park Service in America's bicentennial, and there were like too few to count Black historic landmarks, and they took it upon themselves to change that narrative. They hired friends who were architects and preservation students and experts, and they put together an amazing list of Black things that should be historic landmarks that were Black historic sites. And Madam Walker's house in Irvington, Villa Lewaro, was one of them. But because of the sexism and the misogyny of the preservation world, it was listed as one of Vertner Tandy's sites. That was what made it significant, not as a Madam Walker site. Now, Vertner Tandy deserves all his due, but that was the way things were. But 1976 was a real turning point for finally beginning to get a significant number of Black historic sites listed.
Oh my gosh. Okay, wait. I want to like find this list. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, it is probably, I don't have the list, but if you Google Robert DeForest, Vincent DeForest, 1976 Black Historic Landmarks, and there's Richard Dozier, who is a former dean at FAMU and Tuskegee, I think, in the schools of architecture. Richard is still around, and so Google him, and if I'm happy to, yeah, that's a paper
Thanks.
for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, this is really incredible. It's like, oh yeah, this is a great opportunity to have an interview that can go out to the public. Yet I am just like, thank God I'm recording this because those are my research notes. I can
Right.
transcribe those and
Yeah, I mean, and these right, this whole the whole press I mean, I didn't know anything about that, and then finally, I can't remember what year the Walker Building finally became a National Historic Landmark, but the number of things, as we know, that have been torn down, even in Indianapolis, Madam Walker's house, the feed store that was next door to the Walker Building, that was still there, I don't know, until the 1980s, but we couldn't make the case. And Indiana Landmarks has actually been really important,
Mhm.
in terms of Black historic sites. Marsh Davis, who's the, president of Indiana Landmarks, has really been very conscientious. But I don't do you know, Eunice Trotter? Is that a name that you that
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yeah. So Eunice, I mean, because Marsh made sure that, we got this money from the Lilly Endowment so that Eunice can be in that position.
Yeah, yeah, Eunice is great. She reached out because our Indianapolis episodes were funded through Indiana Humanities, and so when she had heard about that, she connected us and she was just like, "Yeah, if you guys want to do some more stuff in Indiana in general, like let's
Yeah,
talk." And
Eunice is great. She's a great contact for you.
yeah, I mean, I think that you've said so many names of people that like I literally am like I need to do a little bit more research. I need to find out more about this person. So I will absolutely be coming back to you to follow up with some of those threads.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're there and in a position to, to pull these threads. When we finish, I have like a list, I don't know, I think 7 or 8 people who I wanna make sure you know about.
Thank you. I would love that. It's exactly why I honestly why I chose Columbia because I thought that it would be really smart to be in a place that a lot of really knowledgeable and talented people have gone to school there. The alumni just connections are very strong. There's a lot of people who still want to help and do more with specifically because I think there's opportunity to really be just doing more in Harlem that I think is a place that I never expected myself to ever be in. I mean, I was living in
Mhm.
Ohio for a while. And so now I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go to Woodlawn Cemetery and find the grave sites of Madam Walker and A'Lelia because I think that would be for me personally really, really inspirational.
Yeah, when you go, so I'm on their advisory board, so I will when you get ready to go, let me know. So Meg Ventrudo is the executive director, and Susan Olson is the historian. Though I think Susan is actually living in Newport, Rhode Island now, but if Meg is in, she will welcome you and say hello.
Oh, great. Thank you. I mean, it's so funny because the first year students just did a whole studio on Woodlawn. And so I was kind of starting to ask questions about, if they had kind of come across any of the grave sites that I'd mentioned. And I feel like there's almost a follow-up field trip that I really want to kind of coordinate because I think there is something pretty unique about thinking about how African Americans have or where they're buried and how they're buried and how their legacies kind of continued to be showcased through a cemetery or for example I mean I've found myself doing work with Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn and they had what was called freedom lots and
Mhm.
so it was almost a separate African American section for people who might not have been able to afford it but with Madam Walker and A'Lelia I mean it sounds like they were able to afford their plots. I'm curious if anything you can kind of share in regard to why they selected Woodlawn and the place that they chose.
The interesting thing about Woodlawn is that it was never segregated. And if you look when you look on the website, you'll see that they have really leaned into highlighting, African Americans who are buried there, women who are buried there, robber barons who are buried there. But Susan Olson has done an amazing job of telling the history, and I'm just I'm the re what I'm looking at right now, there's They do a lot of stuff with jazz because Miles Davis is buried there, Duke Ellington, Celia Cruz, Cicely Tyson. But this, they commissioned Victor Goines, who is one of Marsalis's best buddies. They just did a concert together in St. Louis. But Susan and Meg commissioned Victor to do this Woodline suite, and there's a Madam Walker tune, there's a Celia Cruz tune, there's a Cicely Tyson tune, and the premiere was at Woodline, and then we did something at Dizzy's Club in New York. But they really lean into the story of the famous African Americans who are buried there. So and the part of the reason probably that the Columbia students did something on Woodline is that the Woodline papers are at
They're archived at Columbia.
right, right.
I could talk to you so much longer, but like there's, that's always opportunity for follow up, I guess, like closing wise, because you are publishing a book here very soon. I mean, is there anything else you wanted to share about that project in particular or anything else you wanted to say?
No, I'll talk when when it's finally done.
Okay, excellent.
We will talk about it. I'm going to have many book parties in New York.
Really appreciate you giving me the time, and I wish you the best of luck with the final stages of getting your book out.
Lord have mercy.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots. This episode was a collaboration with Columbia GSAP's Historic Preservation Podcast. Special thanks to A'Lelia Bundles for her time and generosity in sharing her family's extraordinary legacy. And don't forget to check out her new book, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance. Your host is me, Deqah Hussein-Wetzel, and this episode was edited by myself and Skylar Ficklin. Mixing by Skylar Ficklin. Learn more about A'Lelia and her new book at AleliaBundles.com, and subscribe and listen to the full interview on the Historic Preservation Podcast on Columbia's GSAP SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Columbia GSAP. And with that, thank you for tuning into Urban Roots, the podcast that preserves place through story.